Well, Shalom Torah fans, welcome to the fall feast season. This is, of course, what Michael Rood says. Yeshua came the first time to fulfill the spring feast, and he's coming again in the fall feast. So we are here to preview that with a good friend of ours who's written a brand new book called Gospel of the Skull Crusher. Please welcome Joel Richardson. Joel, welcome.
Hey, Scott, it's great to be with you again.
It is, and we have you by Zoom because we wanted to kind of do this real off the cuff and quickly, and you're into a brand new series. Now, where can people find this series that you're doing? I believe it's on this same book, is that right?
Yeah, I just released my new book. I've been excited about this for a long time. It's actually been sitting on my desktop, procrastination, just staring at it. And I finally just this spring just picked it up, finished it, about to launch into a 1-year Bible study. So I have an app. That's really the best way. It's Joel Richardson Ministries. And then I put my stuff on YouTube, my website, joelstrumpet.com.
Okay, very good. And you're quite active on X too, I think, right?
Yeah, that's mostly where I just mouth off and stir the pot and so forth. X is kind of a dumpster fire, but it's where conversations take place. So yeah, I'm on X a lot.
Very good. Okay, well, good. Well, that's where we find you too, and we get a good laugh out of some of the stuff too. So thank you for that. So we want to dive into your book as well. First of all, where can people get the book, The Gospel of the Skull Crusher? Can you hold it up there too?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I actually just got them. I'm super excited. In fact, I have to show you something because I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but for 20 years before I, was a minister, I was a decorative painter. So art, design, these things have always been important to me. So, this is like my, 8th or 9th book, maybe even 10th book. But this time what I did, this is it without the cover. I really wanted this to, like when you were kids and you would get like the first edition Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, and it smelled, and you would look at the pictures and everything. So like I've wrapped it with really nice linen and did the everything, and I just have to pull this out, like filled it with pictures. Oh, so here's one. Jesus talking to Moses. Jesus is the greater Moses. And then I don't have it here, but I actually gave it a ribbon. So I put a lot into it. It's a neat book. I'm super excited about it.
And where do you get that exactly?
Oh yeah. So I am anti-Amazon as much as possible. It's a great resource for everyone, but they rob authors. So I'm just selling it for now on my website, which is just store@joelstrumpet.com. And I've got the ebook, but I encourage everyone to get the book. Also, let me add, I actually wrote this, most of my other books are written for like a pastoral level or even seminary level. I actually tried so hard, Scott. This was hard for me. I tried to write for a 17 or 18-year-old readership level. And by putting all the pictures in it, I basically made a kid's book for adults because I want people to understand, the overarching message of the gospel. I want them to get the big picture. And I said, I need to simplify it. So each chapter is like 1,500 words. I usually write like 10,000, 20,000 word chapters. These are 1,500 to 2,000, real easy to read.
Yeah, I noticed that when you had your table of contents, which I have in my hand here, there were 33 chapters, and I was thinking to myself, because I had not seen the book yet, how thick is this thing? Because usually, like the way you write, usually, right? So, but anyway, so what we're going to do is we decided to have you on for the fall feast, and you and I have talked about this, where we're going to divide your book, essentially, the themes of it, into 4 parts to celebrate the fall feast here. Yom Teruah, this is what this episode is about. Then we'll come back next week and talk about Yom Kippur, the following week, Sukkot, and then after that, Shmini Atzeret, which is basically the 8th day. So we will, the book is not necessarily about those things. So why don't you tell us, what exactly is the Skull Crusher? Why that title?
Yeah, so it's, look, you always have to have a catchy title. This is just a basics for writing a book, but I always want the material to be really measured. But the again, I'm trying to convey the overarching biblical narrative, the story of redemption, and really the way I'm doing that, the book is just a survey of messianic prophecy. I'm just going through the Bible with the very first messianic prophecy and moving forward. And the first one in the Bible is Genesis 3:15, which is, as soon as the fall has happened, disobedience has resulted in the curse flooding human existence. The Lord makes the declaration to the serpent in Genesis 3:15. He says, basically, history from this point forward will be defined by a conflict between, he says to the serpent, the Lord is actually speaking to the serpent, between you and the woman, so that's between Satan and Eve, and then he says between your seed and her seed. And that means like your descendants, your seed line and her seed line. Now, to be very clear, Satan did not literally have children. This is speaking of those who are spiritual children of their father, the devil. So it's really, history will be defined by conflict between the righteous and the unrighteous. And the Bible tells that story. We're watching this play out on the world stage right now. But then ultimately, out of each one of these seed lines comes an ultimate seed. So on one hand is the Messiah, on the other hand is the Antichrist, and history is moving toward, rapidly moving toward the time when the Messiah will return from heaven and literally kill the Antichrist and sort of fulfill that prophecy. And so this backstory, if you will, of this conflict between these two seed lines, it is actually the most pervasive narrative throughout the entire Bible. And most people miss it, but you start seeing it everywhere. You go, okay, so the very first messianic prophecy, Jesus is called, I'm sorry, I didn't even get to it. The Lord says, he will crush your head. So it's speaking of the ultimate seed. And the Lord says to the serpent, he's going to crush your head. You're going to strike his heel, but he's going to crush your skull. And so then you start seeing it everywhere. You see it in Psalm 110 when Jesus returns. It says he will crush kings on the day of his wrath. You start seeing the motif of crushing and the skull crusher everywhere. And so I tried to draw a lot of these motifs. And again, it's hidden. Oftentimes it's hidden. Sometimes it's overt. It's right in your face. But once you see it, it's everywhere. And so it's kind of a narrative key that opens and unlocks the entire biblical story. And once you see it, it helps you to understand the story from Genesis to Revelation.
Okay, so you've got a definite sections to this book. So how does it, how does it flow? Like you've mentioned here that today we want to talk about, Genesis through Abraham. So how do you lead people through the story? I mean, why don't we just start there?
Yeah, so first of all, just to begin with the fact that Eden, and I actually just taught on this, but Eden is intended to be understood. And again, this is something that's not right on the surface, but it's not just a garden. It's actually a temple. Adam is actually spoken of using words that indicate that he was a priest. Some of the things that he's doing are priestly duties such as guarding and caring for, but ultimately caring for the garden, so to speak. But ultimately, the Garden of Eden is where God dwelt with his people. I mean, it's where he walked in the garden. And that word walked, by the way, is also used later for God dwelling with Israel in her midst in the tabernacle. So Eden was the place where Adam and Eve met with God, and it becomes the pattern for every subsequent temple. Every tabernacle, every temple, and then ultimately the New Jerusalem, it's patterned after Eden. The entire story is about the restoration of all things. You know, Yeshua didn't just come to save our souls, he came to redeem all of creation, and he's going to restore and renew Eden. So with that said, the beginning of the story is the fall. You know, we know the story of the fall. And then immediately, with the Abrahamic covenant in particular, the Lord begins speaking and making promises about the restoration of paradise. We actually see, and one of the things I highlight in the book, Scott, is I want people to understand how early, I mean, even back to the time of Adam and Eve, the early believers, those that were righteous, they actually understood the gospel. They actually were far more sort of spiritually advanced than we often give them credit for. So when you go back and you analyze the Abrahamic covenant, I mean, before we even get out of the book of Genesis, the Lord's intention to give his people, again, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and everyone who joins themselves to Israel through covenant, to his desire to give them the land, which is the springboard for global redemption, and to give them a king over the land. That's all laid out in the Abrahamic covenant. You know, like Abraham would have understood that the seed that was promised, the Lord promised him a seed. It was the same seed that was promised to Eve. He understood that the Messiah was going to come through him, and that he would ultimately one day rule as king over the whole earth. And when he trusted that, when God told him these things and he trusted that, the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. He was saved by grace through faith, just like anyone else. And these guys actually had an anticipation of the return of the Messiah, of Yehovah coming in fire from heaven with an army of angels. They actually understood it all the way back 7 generations from Adam. And half of the Christian pastors today, they don't even like to talk about these things, or they don't understand it. They think it's the weird stuff. Yet this is the central message of the entire Bible.
Hey Torah fans, we just wanted to take a moment to say a huge thank you to all of you, our supporters, our donors, and prayer warriors. Thanks to your faithful support, the End Times Conference in Taiwan, organized by Paul Shea and Kingdom for Jesus, was a powerful success. This all started back in 2017 when Paul Shea invited Michael Rood to speak on the book of the Revelation. After stepping into full-time ministry in 2024, Paul Shea began preparing for this 2025 event using Michael's Revelation timeline as the foundation. One major goal was to have the chronological Gospels printed in Chinese, not just digital. There was real hunger for the physical book. It wasn't easy due to legal restrictions and months of red tape, but we chose to do everything the right way. And praise Yehovah, the books were approved, printed, and delivered just in time for the conference. That was a miracle, and you made it possible. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for standing with us, sowing into this ministry and helping bring the message of the Revelation to Asia. May Yehovah bless you richly for supporting outreach efforts like this at A Rood Awakening International. We could not have done this without you.
Thank you, A Rood Awakening. Blessings from Taiwan.
That kind of brings us to Yeshua's return, and so that's why we're talking about this for Yom Teruah. So they see, or Abraham saw my day, is what Yeshua says, right? And he even calls them a brood of vipers and all these type of things, and they are the seed of Satan. You know, that he actually calls them those things. So when Yeshua returns, so how are we to see this? Like, how are we to recognize this?
Yeah, so as you said, when Yeshua came the first time, he fulfilled the spring feasts, and that's really clear. You know, Passover, you can go through it. He very clearly fulfilled them to a T. And so many people rightly look to the fall feasts, and you've got the blasting of, well, first, obviously, you get Pentecost, but you get the blasting of trumpets. And Pentecost is tied to Sinai. It's tied to the theophany. God coming down on the mountain and making covenant and entering into the new covenant and so forth. But trumpets, it was also very much tied to Sinai. And so, you know, I've touched on this before, but the theophany at Mount Sinai, God coming down on the mountain in thick clouds, with the blasting of the shofar, with the great earthquake, all of that imagery is appropriated and applied to the return of Jesus. He comes from heaven, he comes in blazing fire with an army of angels, with the blasting of the shofars, the blasting of the trumpets, a mighty earthquake. And so the blasting of the trumpets, it announces, it warns, all of these things, it's all of the symbolism is there, but it announces at the beginning, but it also anticipates the culmination of the story, which is, again, the return of the Messiah, the coming of Yehovah in the form of the Son of Man, from heaven to save us in that last 2 minutes, to save us from this world, from persecution, from the Antichrist. He is coming back as a literal warrior, divine warrior from heaven, to save his people and to execute vengeance and punishment against his enemies.
So it seems like it's a full circle type of thing, right? The same way it happened at Sinai, it's going to happen again. So do you think that's why maybe if we're brought up in a Greek mindset where things are, this happened, now it's gone, that happened, now that's gone. So because we don't have this Hebraic mindset of this circular thing, do you think that's why we miss it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most significant reasons that a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters who they don't understand the concept of fulfilled in the Bible. You know, here's a perfect analogy, Scott, is yesterday I loved my wife. I fulfilled my marriage vows yesterday. That does not mean they are over and I'm no longer obligated to fulfill them because I made a covenant unto death. But I did fulfill them yesterday. So our Christian brothers and sisters will say, well, look, it says at the end of Joshua that God fulfilled all of his promises to Israel. Therefore, they're done and past. No, it just means in that generation he was faithful and he's going to continue to be faithful. And as you said, it's a circle. The whole calendar, the way that Lord has organized the rhythm of life, it's this weekly, monthly, yearly cycle. And all of these things are being repeated year after year, rehearsed year after year, remembered year after year, but they're moving toward the final consummate fulfillment. And there's many, we'll call them interim fulfillments or pre-echo fulfillments beforehand, but those are not the final fulfillments. They're just proof that the ultimate fulfillment is indeed coming.
Now, you had expressed to me before the cameras came on, there's this alternative view of when Yeshua returns. And it was from, I forget the name of the author, but maybe if you can explain, it's not Yom Teruah as most of us would assume, but a different feast.
Yeah, so Travis Snow, he's written a few books on this. He makes a really good case that he actually argues, well, maybe Yeshua actually returns on Passover. I lean toward Yom Teruah. I think that it makes the most sense. However, I understand why he takes that view, because the reality is, as I said, the return of Jesus, the end times, it's intended to be understood biblically as the second Exodus, as the greater Exodus. Yeshua is the prophet greater than Moses, the greater Moses. And there's a good case to be made that when he returns, he will actually retrace this procession of the entire Exodus. He'll split the Red Sea again. He'll set the prisoners free, all of these prisoners of war, and he makes ascent up to Jerusalem to be enthroned as king. And so because of that, because the end of the story is described using the imagery and the language of the Passover, I understand that there's actually a lot of imagery and symbolism, even in the spring feasts, about the return of Jesus. It's not like the spring feasts only apply to his first coming. There's actually symbolism there that pertain to his second coming. However, that said, even though we can draw those things out, I still would lean toward him returning on Yom Teruah. But I also want to emphasize that we always need to be cautious and open and careful and humble. And, as to use the Jewish phrase, when Messiah comes, he'll explain all these things.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's funny how we get into this realm of once we understand the Torah and this is the how to be a Christian type of thing. Once we realize that, we go, and we change everything, but then we kind of stop again and think, okay, well, now I know everything, and so everything past this, nope, I'm not going to believe it. But I kind of think like you did, well, wait a minute, we bent our beliefs once. What's to say that Yehovah is not going to have us do that again? Look, consider some other things.
Revelation, the scriptures, these little things that the kids make and then they unfold them and then they just keep unfolding. And that's revelation, that's scripture. Don't ever believe that you've finished unfolding it, because it just is going to keep unfolding until the day that, again, we see Yeshua face to face.
Now, speaking of the skull crusher, Yeshua, so what was your, I just want to ask you just as a final question in this segment, what was your favorite part of writing this book? Or maybe what was the thing that made you go, you know what, because of this, I've got to write this book?
I've wanted to create something very simple, the type of book that you can buy, give to your kids, give to your friends, that that we want to communicate. Like, people who study the Word, we're passionate, we're excited. There's so many things we want to share. I wanted to create a real simplified tool that we can share with people, and I wanted to make it as attractive and enjoyable, filled with pictures. As I said, this really nice book that you just like to hold, the tactile sense of it. I wanted to create a work of art that conveys the gospel. And so this was, it's very different than any of my previous books, as I said, which are much more theological. This is something, it's a mixture between theology and a devotional, it's just very different. So, and the story itself, it makes you fall in love with Yeshua, the story, to see just the incredibly poetic and prophetic nature of the story as it unfolds.
Would it be fair to say, now I don't know if this is the intent of the book or not, but would it be a good gift for some of our Christian friends and family members who don't really understand why we're doing what we're doing? Would it help them kind of connect the dots?
Yeah, especially right now with the explosion of anti-Semitism. You know, you hear all these truly idiotic statements, people saying, I don't know if the Israel today is the Israel of the Bible. You know, if we know the big story, if we know the story, because the Lord tells the same story over and over and over again. When you see it unfold, it inoculates us from a lot of the nonsense, these different ideas that are being embraced in the church, because the church tends to be a very New Testament people. They generally don't know the Old Testament, and this is a way to bring them into the Old Testament by focusing on Jesus. And that's what the Old Testament's focused on anyway. But by really highlighting that, I think it's a great tool to help Christians understand the big story and where it's going and Israel's role in all of it.
So do you use terms like you and I might say Yeshua to each other, but do you use the term Jesus in the Bible to help folks just understand what's going on?
Yeah, and that was actually an editorial decision. I didn't use Yeshua, I used Jesus, because the book is written for a popular Christian audience. And, you know, look, I call myself a Christian, a mere Christian. You know, terms don't mean much to me. But, you know, yeah, I'm going to connect much better in a lot of messianic spaces, you know, messianic theology and that sort of thing. I think the greatest fountain of error is when the church got off and rejected its Jewish roots. And from that, so many other errors have resulted.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's good to know. So that will help just, you know, our folks who just don't understand what we do, put the term that they use for our Messiah, which I think we're all believing the same guy. I mean, you and I got saved under Jesus in the church, so, you know, we didn't change our mind who he was.
I don't get overly caught up in, you know, because you get the folks, they're like, is it Yehovah or is it Yahuwah? And do I have to put 3 apostrophes? And that means that I'm extra spiritual, you know, and the other, and, you know, all those things. Like, we try to be accurate, but, you know, we also don't want to be jerks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Torah terrorists, as it were, yeah. So there again on the bottom of the screen where you can get Joel's book, so store.joelstrumpet.com. There you go right there. Thank you very much, Joel, and I guess we'll see you next week. We'll talk about Yom Kippur.
You got it. Thanks so much, Scott.